When cheap package holidays to Spain arrived in the late 1960s, they didn't just change where British families went on holiday, they emptied an entire coastline. The Clyde resorts, the Fife fishing towns, the Moray villages, all of them had been full every summer for a century, then suddenly weren't. Most never recovered, but a handful survived, and the reason they survived is the same reason they look the way they do. Nobody came to redevelop them. The pier is still there, the fish and chip shop is still there, the promenade, the putting green, the painted rock on the beach, still there. This covers 13 Scottish seaside towns where the 1960s British holiday never quite ended. 1. Millport is the only town on the island of Great Cumbrae, accessible only by ferry from Largs. You hire a bike, you cycle the 4-mile loop around the island, you stop at the Crocodile Rock, a painted stone formation on the beach, maintained by locals since 1913. You eat chips on the seawall. That's what people did in 1962, and that's what people do now. The ferry dependency is what preserved it. When roll-on roll-off car ferries arrived in 1972 and rerouted traffic directly to the Highlands, Millport was bypassed. The bypassing saved it. You can't casually drive through Cumbrae. The ferry is a commitment, a time barrier. It filters out anyone looking for convenience. The town has Britain's smallest cathedral. The Cathedral of the Isles, built 1851, seats 100. It has the same putting green, the same promenade, the same bike hire shops that have operated since before their current owners were born. Houses here are often handed down through families rather than sold. Generational ownership preserves generational traditions. Nothing has been improved, which means nothing has been ruined. If Cumbrae had been connected to the mainland by bridge, it would already be a commuter suburb. The island functions as a sealed ecosystem of tourism. Same families returning every summer, same rituals, same rides around the same rock. 2. Largs is the last surviving major Clyde resort, and the reason it survived is the reason it still works. It refused to modernize. The 2-mile Victorian promenade is unaltered. The putting greens, the shelters, the benches, still there. Nardini's ice cream parlor, opened 1935, still serves from the same Art Deco counter in the same listed building. The PS Waverley, the world's last seagoing paddle steamer, launched 1946, still calls at the pier. The Clyde Riviera resorts that surrounded Largs, Ayr, Ardrossan, Saltcoats, lost their resort identity entirely. Shopping centres, housing estates, industrial estates. Largs kept its promenade, kept its ice cream, kept its ferry. The formula that worked in 1962 still works now. The town rejected a major retail development in 2008 that would have brought chain stores. Residents voted to keep the Victorian character. That decision is visible in every shopfront. Largs Academy still feeds graduates directly into family businesses rather than universities. The pencil monument, erected 1912, looks exactly like a massive pencil, stands on the seafront commemorating a medieval battle, Victorian eccentricity preserved in stone. This is the survivor on the list. It stayed popular by refusing to change. 3. Rothesay, Isle of Bute, the Victorian resort capital of the Firth of Clyde. At its peak, Rothesay received over 1 million day trippers a year from Glasgow by steamer. That world is entirely gone, but the pier pavilion is still there. The promenade still wraps the bay in the same arc, and Rothesay still has the slightly faded, defiant dignity of a place that knows what it used to be and hasn't pretended otherwise. The Victorian toilets, designed 1899, ornate urinals with ceramic tile work and polished brass, are still operational. They're now a tourist attraction themselves, a public convenience as heritage site. The Winter Gardens, the glass pavilion built 1924, stood derelict for years. When it was restored, the restoration was about preservation, not modernization. The abandoned hotels along the waterfront are larger. They're temples to a secular religion that lost its congregation. The trade's fortnight crowds from Glasgow stopped coming. The buildings stayed. Rothesay Castle, 13th century, sits in the town centre. Medieval ruin as neighbour. Zavaroni's ice cream shop, established 1950s, still family run. The ferry terminal is still the economic engine, exactly as in the steamer era. This is faded glamour that never tried to recover. 4. Dunoon had two economies simultaneously, the traditional seaside resort for Glaswegians and an entirely separate economy serving 3,000 US Navy personnel stationed at the Holy Lock nuclear submarine base from 1961 to 1992. Both are gone. What remains is the promenade, the Cowell Highland Gathering, the world's largest Highland Games, held annually since 1894, and a town that absorbed an American base and a Cold War, and still looks from the seafront like 1963. When the base closed in 1992, Dunoon lost its American trade overnight. The commissary, the American school, the wives' clubs, gone. The esplanade and pier are oversized for the current population because they were built to handle steamer crowds that no longer come. The town died twice. The Highland Gathering now carries the entire year. One weekend, 20,000 visitors, then silence. Nuclear submarines parked next to putting greens. That was Dunoon. The submarines left. The putting greens stayed. 5. Pittenweem is a working fishing village in the east nook of Fife where the morning fish market still operates on the harbour. Not as heritage theatre, as actual commerce. Boats land catch, buyers bid, transactions happen. The difference between museum and economy is invisible from the front, and that's what makes it work. Pittenweem never depended on tourism the way the Clyde resorts did. It has working boats, working fishmongers, a working harbour, the crow-stepped gables and red pantile roofs, Flemish-influenced architecture from the 1600s to 1700s trading era, crowd the seafront under strict conservation rules. The street plan is medieval. Car access is so constrained the 21st century has physically struggled to enter. The Arts Festival, established 1982, turns residents' homes into galleries for 1 week every August. Artists moved in because the town was unchanged, but artists moving in begins change. The lobster boats still operate, but increasingly the buyers are Edinburgh restaurants rather than local processors. The performance of fishing survives better than the industry. St. Fillan's Cave, a 7th century hermit cave in the town, is accessible via a key borrowed from a local shop. Pure trust-based tourism. The Giles, the main street, has shops in the same families for generations, shopfronts unchanged since mid-century. What Pittenweem looks like is a postcard. What it actually is, an economy that photographs well. 6. Cullen sits on the Moray Firth under a railway viaduct that no longer carries trains. 8 arches, built 1886, closed 1968. The viaduct stands as a monument to connectivity that was severed. The trains brought tourists, the trains took fish to market. Then the train stopped and Cullen was stranded. The 3 sea stacks on the beach, the 3 kings, define every photograph. Natural landmarks that haven't moved. Every postcard looks Victorian because the subject matter hasn't changed. Cullen skink originated here. Smoked haddock, potato, onion. You can still order it in the same cafes that served it in 1965. Same recipe, same tables. The soup stayed because nothing replaced it. The railway viaduct is now part of the Moray Coast Trail. The rail line repurposed for walking. The town's survival depends on the A98 Coast Road now. If that traffic disappeared, Cullen would too. The beach has won awards. Blue Flag, Seaside Award. A perfect beach with no beach resort infrastructure because the demand never returned. 7. Findocti is a fishing village of white painted cottages perched above a harbour on the Moray coast. Almost no commercial development, no chain restaurants, no new buildings. When the herring industry collapsed, there was no replacement economy. The village simply stayed as it was. The houses are white because white paint reflects light, helps with navigation, practical tradition that became aesthetic identity. The village has no through road. You enter, loop the harbour, leave by the same route. Physical dead end as economic metaphor. The harbour holds pleasure craft now, not working boats. Some spaces just sit empty. The village was used as a film location. Local hero, Whiskey Galore remake, because it photographs as authentic Scotland. The more it's filmed, the more it's expected to stay unchanged. The outdoor pool from the 1930s was filled in during the 1990s. Now it's a memorial garden. The village couldn't afford to maintain it, but couldn't erase it completely. The Victoria Hotel closed in the 2000s. 30 fishing boats operated here in the 1950s, fewer than 5 now. Findorti looks picturesque because it's economically stagnant. Any revival would immediately compromise what makes it photogenic. The constraint is the entire point. 8. Portsoy has a 17th century harbour that still stands exactly as it was built between 1692 and 1825. The layout is unchanged. Modern boats tie up in the same positions wooden boats did 300 years ago. Portsoy marble, actually serpentine, a greenish decorative stone, was quarried here and exported to Versailles in the 1600s. Fireplaces in the Palace of Versailles contain stone from this harbour. That global connection is now just a story. The marble quarry is silent. The harbour it exported from remains. The traditional boat festival, held annually since 1993, celebrates wooden clinker-built boats that are no longer economically viable. Craft that nobody builds for work anymore, preserved as floating heritage. The harbour warehouses have been converted to housing and workshops, adaptive reuse that respects original structures. The sail loft, restored in the 1990s with European regional development funds, is now a community arts venue. EU money preserving Scottish history. Portsoy marble is still worked by a local artisan, producing small decorative items for tourists. Craft reduced to souvenir scale. The 18th century ice house survives intact, interpreted as heritage rather than used. The village doubled down on the past because the present offered no alternative identity. The only story connecting it to grandeur is true, but it's also the only story it has. 9. Stromness is a harbour town on Orkney's west coast where stone houses grow directly from the harbour wall, narrow lanes run off the main street, and the whole place feels architecturally unchanged since the 18th century. The main street is a single winding lane with houses whose gable ends face the water, medieval urban planning still dictating modern traffic flow. For 3 centuries, Stromness was the last port of call for ships heading across the Atlantic. Hudson's Bay Company vessels provisioned here. Arctic expeditions left from here. The last great explorer to leave from Stromness was John Franklin in 1845, bound for the Northwest Passage. He never came back. Stromness is still here. The street layout makes modern logistics difficult. Delivery trucks struggle with the narrow lanes. Economic friction protects character. Logan's Well, a freshwater spring on the waterfront, was where ships took on water for Atlantic crossings. It still flows, now a heritage curiosity. The harbour still has working fishing boats, but increasingly it's North Sea oil supply vessels and Scarpa Flow dive boats. The Pier Arts Centre holds 20th century modernist art in an 18th century building, incongruous and permanent. The town was globally significant while staying physically remote. That combination is visible in every stone. 10. Tobermory, Isle of Mull, the waterfront of brightly painted houses that's become one of the most photographed townscapes in Scotland. The colours, red, yellow, pink, blue, are the same colours they were in the 1960s because the residents have always repainted them the same colours. That decision, made individually by each household, produced one of the most recognisable waterfronts in Britain. Thomas Telford designed the harbour in 1788 as a planned fishing port. It didn't work as a fishing port, it became a holiday town instead. A Spanish Armada galleon allegedly lies in the harbour, the Florencia, which exploded in 1588. Dive expeditions have searched for the gold it supposedly carried for 400 years. Nothing has been found. The mythology is more economically valuable than recovery would be. The town was used as the setting for Balamory, the BBC children's show that ran from 2002 to 2005. Family tourism arrived, but it also infantilized the town's image. The curse of being the Balamory town. The painted houses are maintained by private owners, but tourist expectations create informal coercion. If you own a house on the waterfront, you're expected to keep it colourful. The branding is collective and unspoken. Moray became famous for being photogenic, not for economic success. Now the photography is the economy. 11. Crail is the easternmost village in the East Nook of Fife. It received its royal charter in 1310 and held a market every Sunday for centuries. The Sunday market is gone. The charter is real. The cobbled market square still exists, surrounded by houses that were there when the market was still running. The lobster hut on the harbour sells crab and lobster directly from boats. Fisherman to consumer. No middleman, no restaurant markup. The shortest supply chain possible, operating from the same stone booth since the 1980s. The harbour was rebuilt in the 1820s. The layout is unchanged. Modern boats tie up in the same positions. Crail reached its final architectural form in the 1700s and has never needed updating because it never needed to grow. The crow-stepped gables and red pantile roofs are preserved under strict planning controls. The town has always been this size, which means it never grew and never had to modernize to handle growth. The golf course, Crail Golfing Society, established 1786, is one of the oldest in the world. Golf tourism replaced fishing tourism. The economy shifted, the scale didn't. The village has become a weekender destination for Edinburgh professionals. Second home ownership preserves buildings but changes who lives in them. 12. Gardenstown is stacked up a cliff face above Gamry Bay, houses in tiers connected by narrow paths and steps. Access by road is so difficult, there's a one-way system on the single-track route into the village. In winter, the road closes entirely. The inaccessibility that made Gardenstown economically marginal for a century is the same inaccessibility that preserved its architecture intact. Founded in 1720 by Alexander Garden as a planned fishing village, the grid is still legible. The allocated plots, the narrow lanes, preserved because there's no space for alteration. Cars are almost irrelevant. Physical geography dictates everything. The village has no through traffic because there's nowhere to go. You visit intentionally or not at all. The harbour still holds creel boats, lobster and crab fishing in miniature form. The village school closed decades ago. Children are bused to Macduff now. There's nowhere to build, no room to expand. The cliff is the constraint, and the constraint is the entire point. 13. St. Abbs sits on the southeastern Scottish coast, population under 100, surrounded by a national nature reserve. The village received planning protection as a conservation area in the 1970s, but it looked exactly this way before anyone thought to protect it. The nature reserve arrived to protect the wildlife. The village didn't need protecting. It had simply never changed. St. Abbs Head was where the first foghorn in Scotland was installed in 1876. The lighthouse keeper's cottage is still there. The harbour is still used by creel boats, but increasingly by leisure boats, the ratio shifting from work to play. The diving community is economically significant but small scale. St. Abbs is one of Scotland's top dive sites because of clear water and marine life. No dive resort hotels, just B&Bs and a dive shop. Divers want unspoiled, and commercial development would destroy what they come for. Economic incentive for non-development. The St. Abbs and Eyemouth Voluntary Marine Reserve, established in 1984, was one of the first community-led marine reserves in the UK. Local fishermen voluntarily restricted their own fishing to protect stocks. The decision made 50 years ago is visible in the water now. The village is preserved, but preservation means residents can't expand or build new homes. Young families leave. Almost every building is either a working fisherman's cottage or a holiday let. The binary economy of rural Scotland, locked in by law and by landscape. These aren't museum pieces. People still live here. What looks like preservation to a visitor is just Tuesday to a resident. The painted house that photographs beautifully is someone's mortgage. The harbour that looks untouched since 1960 is where someone moors the boat they use to pay bills. The question isn't whether these towns are authentic or struggling. The question is whether there's actually a difference. Authenticity and economic marginality look identical from the outside. The pier is still there because it was too expensive to demolish. The promenade is unchanged because no developer thought it was worth replacing. The fish and chip shop survived because the family couldn't afford to sell. What you're looking at when you visit these places is accidental preservation. Most of them were bypassed by railways that closed, by ferry routes that moved, by package holidays that made Scottish drizzle untenable. A handful doubled down on what they had always been, because pivoting required capital they didn't have. The result is the same either way. Towns where the 1960s never quite ended, not because anyone decided to preserve them, but because no one decided they were worth changing. If you're tired of places that have been improved into something unrecognizable, these towns deliver. If you want the last genuine British seaside experience, bike hire, putting greens, chips on the seawall, it still exists, but it exists because it was forgotten. And the more it's remembered, the less it will resemble what made it worth remembering in the first place.